Good afternoon. Happy Wednesday, everybody. And welcome to the next edition of our PFF's Disease Education webinar series. I'm Amy Hajari Case. I'm a medical advisor for the foundation, and we are here today on the topic exposed, talking about the impact of inhaled exposures on pulmonary fibrosis. Such an interesting topic. I think it comes up a lot clinically, and there certainly is research interest in this area as well. For those of you who have not joined us previously on our Zoom platform or for any of our webinars before, I just want to go through a couple of housekeeping items as we're getting started. If you will go to the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see some controls there. You have an option for Q&A. If you have questions or trouble with the platform or questions about the topic, you can submit those through the Q&A button there. Just type it in. If it's a problem with the webinar, we can try to help you troubleshoot behind the scenes. And if it's a question about the topic, we will have time at the end of our session today to try to get to as many of our questions about inhaled exposures and Dr. Lee's research, which she's going to tell us a bit about at the end of our session today. Also, we have a great feature. If you haven't been with us for a little while, you can do live captioning for those for whom that might be helpful. If you go to your control panel, you can look for the More button. On mine, it has 3 little dots, and you can open that up, and there's a selection for captions. You can choose to show the captions. It does a pretty good job, so if you want to take advantage of that, go ahead. Additionally, we have a file that's been shared in our chat box there, where you can click and download these slides for your current reference or to look at later. We will be recording this session, so it will be available to view again at a later date if you would like to do so. I think that is all of my, I have one more housekeeping note. At the end of our session today, there will be an opportunity to give us feedback on a survey. So please stay a moment and let us know how you think we're doing, and any topics we may cover in the future. We'll certainly take those into consideration. Now I'm going to introduce our speaker today. I'm so excited to have Dr. Cathryn Lee. She is an instructor of medicine in the section of pulmonary and critical care medicine at the University of Chicago. And she is one of our Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation funded scholars. Our scholars program funds early career researchers that are doing great work in pulmonary fibrosis, both clinical and more basic science, as well as translational research, and funds these folks so that they can get their career started off and hopefully go on to apply for other types of grant awards and funding for their careers and get them started. So her research focuses on inhalational exposures, especially workplace exposures, and clinical outcomes in patients with interstitial lung disease. So I am so excited that we have Dr. Lee here today, and I am going to turn things over to you. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thanks so much, Dr. Case, for that kind introduction, and thanks to the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation for having me, and for all of you for being here today. Before I begin, I just want to give a little, you can read the slide for the medical disclaimer, but any information I give isn't medical advice, and you should talk to your doctor about any personal medical advice that you may need. So my talk is about inhalational exposures and interstitial lung disease. And I think we've all been bombarded by news stories recently of all sorts of exposures and how they relate to both lung health as well as a patient's global health. And so, for instance, whether it be, personal exposures that you might experience like vaping, ambient exposures that people might experience, whether it be air pollution or wildfire smoke, or exposures that people might have experienced in the workplace or in other sorts of jobs. So for instance, coal mining or military exposures like burn pits, there's all sorts of information that's coming out every day about how the air we breathe might impact our overall health and our lung health specifically. However, when I talk to my ILD patients, they oftentimes experience frustration because they're told that their disease is without a clear cause, or we're not exactly sure why patients have their diseases that they do. And so it's kind of one of the cruxes of my research is try to link those two things, is to try to get more information about the exposures that we might have heard about in the news or that we might know that we've had in our lifetime, and see if we can tie them to ILD disease onset as well as any outcomes in interstitial lung disease. And like other chronic diseases, what we know, while we might not know for sure what a clear cause is for someone's interstitial lung disease, we have some idea or a model of how a lot of these diseases develop in the first place. And so what might occur is that there's certain genetic risk factors in certain individuals. So for instance, there's MUC5B or other types of genetic mutations that a person is born with. They then encounter some sort of environmental or occupational exposure, whether it be smoking, silica dust, birds, molds, asbestos. We'll get into some of these in my talk. And then they have other risk factors that might predispose them to lung disease. So for instance, ongoing aspiration of stomach contents, metabolic syndrome, diabetes, connective tissue diseases, as we all know, are tied to interstitial lung diseases. And all those things together ultimately lead to the wide variety of ILD diagnoses that we know about that are listed here. And so the crux of my research and my experience has been trying to focus on these inhalational exposures and how they relate to both onset as well as clinical outcomes of interstitial lung disease, with the hope that ultimately, if we can fix this upstream, we might ultimately in the future be able to prevent disease in the first place. So that brings me to what we doctors call the alphabet soup of interstitial lung diseases. And there's a wide variety of subtypes of interstitial lung diseases, all with their individual acronyms, which can be kind of confusing. So you may have heard about idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, one of the more common types of interstitial lung disease, and that doesn't classically have a clear-cut one cause associated with that particular disease. ILD might also be from connective tissue diseases, things like rheumatoid arthritis or scleroderma, or be associated with autoimmune features. So patients who have, some sort of signs in either their symptoms or their laboratory findings that might be suggestive of an autoimmune process, but they don't have a formal connective tissue disease diagnosis. There are also other specific interstitial lung diseases like sarcoidosis and these rare interstitial lung diseases down here. And then what I have here highlighted in red are the diseases that are most classically associated with inhalational exposures, those being hypersensitivity pneumonitis and pneumoconiosis. And so this is what we think of coal miner's disease or coal worker's lung or silicosis. And so the crux of my work thus far has been, while we have these diseases in red that are listed here, I have personally experienced, as well as a lot of my colleagues, that a lot of these inhalational exposures are present in patients with a wide variety of ILDs. And so can we link these exposures to these other disease processes? And so when I started my fellowship, I did a literature review and I was looking on, what do we know about inhalational exposures and these other interstitial lung diseases? And there are some case series, which are small collections of patients and reports of these patients that have been linked to specific exposures and specific interstitial lung diseases. So for instance, these exposures can be lower level or a longer period of time. The classic example I use for this is that there's a case series of dental personnel, both dentists and hygienists, at a group in Virginia, and they found that people who had worked at a dental office were much more likely to experience idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis at a much higher rate compared to people who weren't dentists in the same geographic area. But there's also examples and historical examples of having a high level of exposure over a shorter period of time, and that being associated with interstitial lung disease. And the classic example of that is the World Trade Center disaster. And so this group of researchers found that patients who were first responders in the World Trade Center disaster were more likely to have were more likely to have pulmonary fibrosis compared to people who did not respond to the Trade Center. And interestingly, in this study, they also found that patients who were at the site for longer were even more likely to have this disease compared to those who weren't. But while we have some reports of exposure of certain exposures being related to interstitial lung disease onset, there's a less clear relationship in prior literature about these exposures and how they're related to disease outcomes. And by that, I mean receiving a lung transplant or survival. So for instance, there was a group in Korea who found that patients who had occupational dust exposure, most notably wood and metal exposure, had an increased rate of death if they had in the setting of idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. However, another study in the Netherlands of patients with idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis found that exposure to mold or bird or other organic like farming dust was actually associated with improved survival in patients with idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. So the data is a little mixed, and it's unclear if that's because of the certain patients and the certain groups of patients that are being studied, or whether it's the specific exposures being studied, or whether it's just not a long enough follow-up time. A lot of that data is still unclear and was kind of the inspiration for my fellowship and beyond. And so when I began my pulmonary fellowship, my pulmonary training, my mentor and I published a letter to the editor where we discussed the fact that while we have these small case series and these small groups of patients that we have described these relationships between exposures and diseases, to the point when I started my pulmonary fellowship, there really wasn't a systematic look at all exposures that a patient might experience and their relationship to interstitial lung disease. And so we wrote a letter to the editor kind of calling on the pulmonary community and the research community that in order to identify these inhalational exposures, we have to collect this data. And that's why it's so excellent that since the publication of this letter to the editor, the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation Registry has begun systematically collecting information about exposures on all these ILD patients that are enrolled in the study. So that brings me to my fellowship project was basically looking at our ILD clinic at the University of Chicago and assessing the overall rates of inhalational exposures among the patients that we saw in clinic. And so this was a study of about 156 patients that all had interstitial lung disease of a wide variety of types. And similar to so what we did is we took a look with our electronic health record, and it basically prompted us to ask 5 major topics of questions. Each questions were very short. The whole thing took about 5 minutes, maybe. We asked questions about occupational exposure, specifically asbestos exposure, silica exposure, wood dust or construction exposure, hobbies. We asked about questions related to gardening and automotive work and things of that nature. We also asked about the presence of a bird in the home or at work, the presence of mold at home or at work, and then some other exposures. And those were kind of, random and specific, including things like, was your house over 100 years old, suggesting that you had mold, for instance. And what we found, kind of confirming our hypothesis, was that inhalational exposures were seen across a wide variety of ILD diagnoses, and about 65% or 2/3 of our patients have reported some inhalational exposure. And it's similar to what I mentioned on that slide with all the different disease subtypes. It wasn't just those diseases in red. It wasn't just, hypersensitivity pneumonitis. And in fact, 45% of connective tissue disease patients and 64% of patients with autoimmune features had reported some exposure that might have been significant in the development of their disease. And, I'm a fan of fancy figures as a researcher, but I'm also a good fan of some old-fashioned Venn diagrams. And I really like this figure from the paper because it explains that, it takes all the different exposure subtypes. And while there are some patients, so for instance, 27 of 156 patients only had occupational exposures and 14 out of 156 patients only had mold exposures. As you can see, a lot of patients had multiple exposures. And what this tells me, and what I think should tell the pulmonary community, is we shouldn't just stop at asking one question. As soon as someone says yes about one exposure, like birds, that doesn't mean we shouldn't be asking the rest of these questions, because there are probably a lot of exposures that we all experience in our lifetime that may be contributory towards ILD onset. And then the second question I had with this fellowship project was, okay, In addition to having these exposures, are there certain patterns of exposures by sex, by gender, by race, and by diagnoses? And what we found is that men were more likely to have occupational exposures and also exposures related to their hobbies. Again, kind of makes sense given the fact that a lot of the questions were about asbestos and silica. We also interestingly found that white patients were more likely to have bird exposure compared to other races. Now, some might argue, does this mean that we should only be asking white men about exposures? Of course not. I think what this means is that the literature that we have to date is very focused on certain exposures that might occur in men and might occur in white populations. And it's even more important to be more systematic in the future so that we can get all sorts of other disease exposure relationships that might occur in more diverse populations. And again, just hammering home the point, we also found that patients had a wide variety of diagnoses, and we could find no relationship between what type of disease subtype they had and the type of and whether or not they had an exposure in this relatively small cohort. And so these figures just highlight in the top 3 occupational exposure groups. So metal, organic, and silica were the top inhalational exposure subgroups. And we found that again, these were pretty male predominant. They were pretty white predominant, but had a wide variety of exposures. And then the other question that came up was, okay, in patients who already have ILD, does having a history of this exposure relate to a person's survival? And the answer is maybe. So at least for this initial study, and I'll talk about more studies that I've done later. But for this initial study, we found that having the presence of an inhalational exposure may be associated with worse survival, with worse transplant-free survival, meaning living without a lung transplant. But this did not reach statistical significance when we adjusted for things like age and gender and race and smoking and other things that kind of coexist along with those inhalational exposures. So that led me to the first project of my faculty year, which was validating that previous study and looking at a different set of cohort and different geography. Because as you might imagine, one small cohort at the University of Chicago in the South Side of Chicago might be very different from, other places across the United States and across the world. And in particular, University of Chicago, for instance, is nearby Gary, Indiana. So we have a lot of steel mills. And so I was interested in going to other places, particularly places with other, maybe more organic exposures. So I found this Canadian cohort, the Canadian Registry for Pulmonary Fibrosis, which is about 8 clinical sites in Canada with about 4,000 patients. And a lot more rural, as you might imagine, and more farming up in Canada for sure. And so this particular registry, as compared to that quick electronic-based 5, bucket series of questions that I asked in my Chicago cohort, this had even more exposures and more information regarding both environmental exposures that I listed here, as well as 17 discrete jobs with yes or no questions, things like longshoreman, miner, automotive worker, things like that, to try and get at particular exposures that might be associated with disease. And so what do we find in this study? And so we found, kind of similar to my previous study, that the presence of exposures was linked to male gender. The other interesting thing about the Canadian data set, as well as the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation registries, that has detailed family histories. And so what we found is that having a family history of interstitial lung disease actually increased your risk of having an exposure, which was kind of maybe counterintuitive when you first think about it. But first off, I think that similar to that multiple hit model that I talked about earlier, where someone who's genetically predisposed has to have an exposure, I think this is just showing that both of those things are oftentimes present in our interstitial lung disease patients before they develop disease. We also, this is and this is why science is cool. We kind of found a contrary outcome than we found for my first study. And we found that patients who had an inhalational exposure, particularly an organic exposure, so like mold or bird, actually had improved pulmonary function and improved survival. And because this data set was bigger, we were able to kind of delve down deep and figure out, okay, what's driving that? Are there particular diseases that are driving that? And we found that this was particularly happening in people with bird or mold exposures and people who had hypersensitivity pneumonitis. And so I personally think that what this is telling us is that Hypersensitivity pneumonitis, as I mentioned earlier, is one of those diseases where people already know about exposures. And so my guess is that clinicians, regardless of this survey, were already asking people about those exposures in those patients and asking them to get rid of them. And that might be associated with improved survival. And so maybe if we find further relationships in the future, we can intervene earlier on other patients as well. So I want to shift now and talk about my ongoing work that's sponsored by the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation, looking at workplace exposure and job types and early interstitial lung disease. And so in order to do that, I want to explain a couple of different concepts. So the first is the concept of a full occupational history. And as opposed to the prior work that I had done prior to my Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation scholarship and my project thereof, my prior work had mostly focused on a series of yes or no questions. So a series of, 5 major yes or no questions, or a series of 17 major yes or no questions. But to that point, I nor anyone else had done a full occupational history in all ILD patients who came into clinic to see, are there new job types that we don't know about that might be associated with interstitial lung disease via an exposure route. And the other concept that I think is really exciting and is really emerging in our interstitial lung disease field is the idea of interstitial lung abnormalities, or ILA. And so what these are kind of preclinical interstitial lung disease, or a precursor to interstitial lung disease, where sometimes on CAT scan, and this is a diagram here, you'll see in the picture A here that there's just these really fine small amounts of white that are suggestive of like pre-scar formation. And that's these interstitial lung abnormalities. And sometimes those can progress to overt interstitial lung disease where patients have symptoms, which is represented by this picture B over here. And so the idea is maybe if we are able to recognize these interstitial lung abnormalities, and maybe if we're able to figure out what high risk exposures are out there, then we could theoretically be able to intervene earlier in the disease course for these patients. And so to talk a little bit more about the occupational history. So what the PFF has supported me through is developing an occupational, is being able to take the time and energy and hire assistants to help me take full occupational histories on all patients. And this is relying on this concept of that started in the COPD, or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or emphysema is another term for it, literature. And what they've found is that just asking this one question, have you been in contact with vapors, gases, dust, and fumes on a regular basis at work or at home? Has a reasonable accuracy for determining whether or not someone really did have that exposure, when they have experts and industrial experts go to that workplace and really intensively interview that patient for multiple hours and determine whether or not they had an exposure. Similarly, there's been work that's found that a patient's own subjective measures of intensity. So for instance, if a patient says, I had a low exposure to this, a medium exposure to this, or a high exposure to this, have reasonable accuracy. Again, not 100%, but reasonable accuracy for determining whether or not that exposure was that intense or not. And so using these concepts, we developed not only a full occupational exposure history survey, but asked a variety number of questions. So it's a multiple page survey. It still only takes like 10 to 15 minutes. So I don't want to go, so I didn't want to publish the whole thing here, but this basically gives you a rundown. So there's occupational. So we first asked, did you have a job associated with vapors, gases, dust, or fumes? They say yes or no. Then they list those jobs. They list whether or not there was personal protective equipment like masks. They list whether or not that subjective intensity was low, medium, or high. They list the particular exposure that they think they might have been exposed to. They list the industry and even the company if they have that information. And then even for the jobs that they answered no, we asked them to write down all of those jobs. We then ask about home exposure. So you can list, they're basically listed here with the same idea. Did they think it was low, medium, or high intensity? And same with hobbies. We then ask about ongoing exposures, because in a lot of literature, this isn't overtly stated. So is this exposure something that you're currently experiencing? Because that obviously would be important and an easy thing for the clinician to intervene upon. We also ask, as a separate project that we're still working on, did you experience secondhand smoke? Because while we know that firsthand tobacco smoke is obviously harmful, secondhand smoke might also be harmful as well. And so what we do is the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation has funded a research assistant to kind of come into me with clinic and ask all of these questions. If the patient doesn't have time, something else that we do is we actually provide them with an envelope and they can mail the survey back after they've thought about it for a few minutes at home. So we have some preliminary findings of our first 150 patients. We have about 200 enrolled, and we're still analyzing outcomes and pulmonary function changes over time, because as you might imagine, that takes time, over the span of years. But for this initial enrollment period, we found that of 150 patients, about 108 of them had an occupational history, meaning about 42 of them didn't work. Kind of similar proportions to my prior work, about 72% of patients had work-related exposures, so said yes to that vapors, gases, dust, and fumes question. We haven't initially found any association with any specific disease subtypes like my other work. Interestingly, the most common careers are steel mill working. As I mentioned, we were kind of near Gary, Indiana, but also school teaching. And again, not to say that school teaching is associated with interstitial lung disease. I think, we do have a pretty female predominant cohort, but it is going to be interesting down the line to see if we can start to develop or start to understand whether there's some female predominant jobs that are associated with interstitial lung disease. Similarly, the school teachers that we see, a lot of them, when I ask them, have a lot of moldy buildings that they've been working in, and that might also affect their experience of their disease. And the most common industry that we've seen is manufacturing. About 80% of it have some sort of home-related exposure. So again, looking back here, whether it be, mold, water damage, or flooding, that sort of thing. And about 60% have hobby-related exposures, mostly gardening or painting. So that's the initial, data set. We're presenting that at the CHEST conference this fall, and we hope to get more information in the future, linking that to specific clinical outcomes, including things like radiology. For the interstitial lung abnormality component of my project that the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation is sponsoring me on, I'm studying the coronary artery risk development in young adults, or CARDIA data set. And so this is a really exciting data set, and one of the reasons I was really excited to propose this idea to the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation. Because basically what it is you'll see this heart here. It started out as a heart data set for heart disease, and it started in young adults. So this is healthy people without any form of lung disease, including no interstitial lung disease, in the 1980s. And they followed these patients, are still following them right now. So followed it for about 40 years now. And they were returned for 8 regular exams. And even though this was a heart study, the investigators were forward thinking enough that they actually got spirometry, or pulmonary function testing, for each of those regular exams. They also, each time they were there, asked them about not only what job they had, but intervening jobs that they had as well. They have spirometry, as I mentioned. And then in year 25 or later, so 2010 or later, they also have CAT scan imaging that we're able to link this information to. And so for this preliminary analysis, we hope to do more. We are going to do more in-depth full job analyses in the future. But for this first one, we just took a look at what job titles people had at year 20 of the study. So this is what jobs did they have in 2005. We then looked at their pulmonary function testing in 2005, 2010, 2015, as well as their radiology, their CT scans from 2010. So our initial idea was, can we link any specific job titles or job groups to any pulmonary function changes or radiology features that might be consistent with interstitial lung disease, or early interstitial lung disease, or interstitial lung abnormalities? Because, as you might imagine, there's a lot of different things that coexist with your job that might also affect your pulmonary function. We adjusted our analyses for things like age, race, gender, smoking, and body mass index. And so what we found was that these were the job groupings that were associated with pulmonary function changes. You'll notice that the job groupings in bold are the job groupings that were associated with both pulmonary function changes and CAT scan changes. And so you'll note that the two that are in bold, that occur with both functional and radiologic changes, are healthcare support and installation, maintenance, and repair. Installation, maintenance, and repair is pretty intuitive to me, whether there's drilling or installation or, other types of concrete or metal or welding that might be experienced by those jobs. Healthcare support is particularly surprising to me though. So healthcare support isn't healthcare provider. So it's not doctors or nurses. It's not dentists. It's the support staff. So for instance, home health aides, home medical workers, nursing assistants, and so forth. And so what that tells me again is similar to those school teachers who might work in moldy buildings, a lot of the healthcare aides and healthcare support workers that I see in clinic report that they have that they go into a lot of homes with mold, or they go into a lot of homes with birds, or they might work in an area with ambient air pollution or things like that. So in addition to the job tasks that people have, I think it's going to be interesting and a challenge for us as researchers to kind of better describe the environments in which people are working. In addition, as you can see here, being in building and grounds into construction and transportation were associated with pulmonary function changes. Again, that makes intuitive sense to me. And then interestingly, arts and media occupations and community and social service, and again, education, training, and library, which includes those teachers, were associated with CAT scan changes that might be suggestive of early interstitial lung disease. Again, these are preliminary findings. We're still not sure what the particular exposures are, but it's definitely interesting to think about, what could be contributory towards interstitial lung disease or early interstitial lung disease in these patients. So overall, the conclusions from this work thus far are that, I think the environment and identification of workplace and other environmental exposures in interstitial lung disease really represent an opportunity to better identify patients at risk of both ILD onset and ILD progression. And we're still in the nascent phases of this, and we're still in the early stages of figuring out which exposures those are and how we could mitigate them. But I think this really represents another avenue by which we can improve the lives of ILD patients, in addition to the important things like, medications and oxygen and things like that. I also think that full job histories are really going to be a way to uncover these novel exposure disease relationships. And in the future, I think things like artificial intelligence and clinical decision support tools are really going to be a way where we can use the, massive computing power that we have in the 21st century in order to better uncover these disease exposure relationships that might not have been super obvious to us at this point. And so one of the biggest questions that my patients ask me is, what can I do? And while the answer is, there's not a whole lot at this point that patients themselves are able to change from an environmental or occupational exposure standpoint individually, there are a few things that I think are important to take home. So one is, I think it's really important to tell your doctor your work history, even if it's remote, even if you were in the military, in the 60s or 70s, it's important to know these things in order to provide the best care for you. In particular, a good example of this is that asbestos or silica exposure, in addition to being associated with interstitial lung disease, are also at risk for other diseases like cancers or infections like tuberculosis. And so it's important for your doctor to know if you're at risk for these in the future, even if it might not necessarily be contributory to your interstitial lung disease at any one moment in time. I think it's also important to note that there are certain professions, for instance, firefighting and mining are the two biggest ones, that have known worker protection systems in place, and you should use them. So for instance, firefighters have to have regular pulmonary function testing. Miners have to have regular pulmonary function testing as well as x-rays. And if your workplace is telling you that you should be wearing a respirator, please wear one. I know it's difficult, but it really is in the best interest for your health. There's other professions other than this. I met a fisheries biologist this week, for instance, who wears personal protective equipment when he's working with certain chemicals. So if this is suggested by your workplace, you should do it. I think it's important in this day and age to take care in particularly polluted areas or times. We all remember last summer when there was wildfires everywhere and wildfire smoke everywhere. And I know Chicago was pretty rough last summer as well. And regardless of that, I'm always asking my patients to check either on their iPhone or their smartphone. If you don't have a smartphone, weather.com also has this information of the air quality index, or the AQI. And every day in your area and your zip code comes out with a number. They spit out a number. whether it's good, fair, or poor. And then in the fair arm, it'll also say take care in sensitive groups. And what I always tell my patients is if you have interstitial lung disease, you count as one of those sensitive groups. So if it tells you that sensitive groups might want to stay indoors, if you're able, I understand that oftentimes we can't, we have to go outside, and obviously we understand that. But if you're able, I would stay home at those times. And I think another important thing to know is that even if your particular disease has been deemed idiopathic, that doesn't mean, or without a clear cause, that doesn't mean it's a complete mystery. And that doesn't mean that that researchers are every day investigating new ways and new avenues and new pathways by which this disease operates and works. And so with that, I would like to thank and acknowledge all of you, all of our interstitial lung disease patients and their caregivers for all of the work that you do every day for yourself and for others, and for all the inspiration that you've given all of us in the pulmonary community. I'd like to thank the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation Scholar Program. They've funded my research for the past 2 years and really enabled me to do a lot of this work and launch a lot of work that's currently ongoing. I'd like to thank my mentors, Dr. Mary Strack, who's also a key member of the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation, as well as Dr. Valerie Press at the University of Chicago, Dr. Deji Adegansoy, also a frequent contributor to the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation's also in our interstitial lung disease group and has done great work. I'd like to give a special shout out to we have a University of Chicago undergraduate student who's been able to help me a lot and been my research assistant for these past 2 years. I'd like to thank the section of Pulmonary and Critical Care and my collaborators that are listed here. And with that, I will take questions.
Dr. Lee, thank you so much. That is, I think this is an area that has so much unmet need and a lot to learn. And so to see you doing such great work in this space is exciting, I think, and encouraging, because it is one of those things that, to me, in clinic, when I'm seeing patients, I'm sure you feel this way also, it's just one of those, well, it could be there's circumstantial evidence. I don't know nothing, but I can't say that this is like the one true cause, right? And
Right.
so it can be very, I think, challenging, I think, for people to hear that. It's sometimes challenging for doctors to say, I don't know, or I'm not sure. And so getting a lot more information about this area, I think, is really, really great. We have a lot of great questions. And so I'm going to run through some of these and we'll get to as many as we can. I wanted to go back to, you made some comments about protective equipment and going with what your workplace recommended. But if there are people who have at-home exposures or hobbies in particular, maybe they don't have specific recommendations from their workplace, is there something that they can do to try to decrease an exposure? I mean, so I've had patients, for example, they knew they had a workplace exposure, but they couldn't leave work, right? People have to work as much as they can. They have to have jobs. And so what do you recommend when you see patients that way?
Yeah, and I think my disclaimer before I say things like this is that, there's not a whole lot of evidence one way or the other, but some things that I recommend for my patients, I actually take from a lot of the COVID literature. And something that did happen in the COVID pandemic was there was a lot more research just on general ventilation and general protection and general respiratory protection. So a couple of the things that I oftentimes suggest are opening up a window. So for instance, if like I have patients that no matter what really want to work in their workshop, and I always say like, okay, can you please just make sure, like I have them describe the workshop to me and, open up a window or use a mask during those times. Usually in outdoor spaces, you don't necessarily need a mask, but if people do have a lot of exposure, so for instance, like really avid gardeners, again, there's not a whole lot of science behind this, but if they can tolerate a mask and they really want to do it and they really want to continue to garden, sometimes I will suggest something like that. Those are the big things that I think of, but obviously, and I think this is going to be an element of research and advocacy in the future, is a lot of these a lot of these occupations, but honestly, hobbies too, are people's livelihoods and people's, it is a big part of life. And so I'm not suggesting that everyone, seal themselves in a hermetic, a hermetic bubble, as it will. And so I think in the future, there's going to be a lot more masks. There's going to be a lot more PPE. There's going to be a lot of improved ventilation in order to kind of have these administrative controls, as OSHA calls it, as opposed to individual measures.
That's a great answer. Thank you. I'm gonna piggyback on that too, because you brought up gardening. Um,
Mhm.
Certainly, I'm in the South. I don't know how many people garden in Chicago, but everybody's got a backyard garden around here. And what sorts of things are, I don't think of myself getting a lot of exposures when I'm digging in the dirt, putting on my tomatoes and picking them later. But
Yeah.
what sort of things do people get exposed to in gardening? And it is more like large scale types of things, or when they're putting down pesticides, or things like that. What do people get exposed to in that process?
Yeah, I think we're still figuring that out. And I want to put the big caveat by gardening that, again, like none of these had, control groups, for instance. So I'm sure there's tons of people without ILD, myself included, who enjoy gardening. But I think what I tell people is, there's some people who really get down in the dirt and really like dig up a lot of dust, or as you mentioned, the pesticides and the large scale pesticides. And that's what I try and tell people to avoid. But, simple watering, simple gardening, that sort of thing, I don't think is anything that necessarily we need to intervene on at this point. But I do think that the other point being that I think as we get more specific about are there particular patterns on CT scan or patterns of disease that are associated with specific exposures, like organic mold or just like mold, for instance. So if someone had a very classic looking hypersensitivity pneumonitis picture, for instance, and they were a really avid gardener, I might tell them to back off. Whereas if they had a very clear-cut connective tissue disease, or, very clear-cut idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, that may be less contributory, although not certain. Carrie Johansson actually has some decent work from this lately about how organic exposures and HP, again, kind of that similar relationship that we talked about, also might be related.
That's great. And I'm going to ask a little bit more about that now.
Mhm.
Talk a little bit about why. I think now you've brought up sort of the anecdotal experience of, well, I have a backyard garden. Lots of people do.
Mhm.
Lots of people don't have ILD.
Mhm.
And talk about the importance of using these larger data sets and interrogating these things further to try to understand that. My anecdotal experience is like, this tiny slice of what's out there in the world. How are these really helping you? I think you explained some of that, but I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about the importance of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think just anything that involves a large scale registry and a large scale systematic look at everything someone's encountered over their life has a higher chance of finding something that might be contributory, as opposed to relying on volunteer information, or relying on information that is just signed up off of a checklist. So, for instance, how am I going to put this? So it kind of goes back to that idea that I found in my first project, that that exposures that related to male gender or to white populations were associated had a stronger prevalence in interstitial lung disease. And I think if we're only asking certain populations certain questions, or we're only highlighting questions that we've known from before, we're not going to find new things. In order to find new things, we have to look at everything that someone's had over the span of their lifetime, which is harder to do on an individual human to human level, and why these big data sets, and why advanced machine learning and modeling techniques are going to be helpful. As we get more information about as medical transcribing gets easier. So for instance, at our center, we have like an artificial intelligence pilot where they take a recording of our conversation and write down the entire conversation in like a paragraph form really quickly. I think that will enable more efficient history taking and more complete history taking that will then instantly be documented in the medical record, and then can be instantly analyzed by a computer. And then instantly those relationships between that and disease can start to be figured out.
That's really fantastic. I think all of this is so interesting that as we look at these, larger bits of data and try to make sense of it. So I think this is, I'm just really um, glad you're doing this work. I'm gonna move to another area of questions. Let's take this down a couple of different roads. So we've had a couple of questions about military exposures. Certainly one that comes to mind that we hear a lot about is the Agent Orange exposure.
Mhm.
I think in the clinic, with our patients, there it seems to be a little bit of inconsistency about is this related or not related? Is there disease related or not related to that exposure? It seems like there are a lot of things that have been deemed related, potentially this one. Can you talk a little bit more about number one, what we do know about the association or not a lack of association with Agent Orange and the development of pulmonary fibrosis?
Yeah, absolutely. So probably the strongest evidence linking Agent Orange to pulmonary fibrosis, specifically idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis or IPF, comes from work done by Dr. Bhuvika Kaul, who also was a Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation scholar, actually, looking at and she linked VA data. So basically, the Veterans Administration has information on all of its patients about their service time and where their service time occurred. And the veterans, if I'm understanding the details correctly, the Veterans Administration, for everyone who had boots on the ground in Vietnam, has deemed them as likely exposed to Agent Orange. What she did was she linked all of she studied patients who both did have this, VA flag as likely exposed to Agent Orange or did not have exposure to Agent Orange, and found that patients who were exposed to Agent Orange had about an 8% higher chance of having idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis compared to those who don't. And so that's a real bump, but it's not like the highest bump, right? Like in terms of like overall risk, for instance, smoking is a much higher risk level of that than Agent Orange itself. It is interesting, and I think it links there, but it kind of points out kind of the limitations of all of our research, including my own, which is that we're linking these specific job types or these specific duties to the disease without knowing exactly what that linkage is. And so, for instance, she mentioned that she postulated in her own paper that in addition to Agent Orange, a lot of these patients were exposed to Agent Blue or other types of chemicals in Vietnam. So it's, again, as you mentioned earlier, it's like I don't know for sure, this could have contributed, but there is more evidence pointing out there that there's certain military exposures that can be associated with pulmonary fibrosis.
That's a great answer. Thanks. And I think this definitely affects people. So it was great to see Dr. Call's paper. I think that gets a good start on some of that circumstantial evidence and trying to bring some help to folks and help them understand and help us understand how that
Mhm.
impacts them. So since we've gone to the past and talking about like a remote past exposure and the impact on somebody's disease state today, can you talk a little bit about latency and I don't know, I'm sure your work is getting at some of this, but it seems to me that both remote exposures with a latency period are important and potentially some we know are pathogenic, meaning that they cause disease like asbestos exposure. But then there are others that people have current exposure seems to be a more likely culprit as opposed to something they saw in the remote past. Um, potentially a bird or chicken exposure or something like that comes to mind as an example. Can you talk a little bit about kind of the differences and how you're approaching that in the work that you're doing?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think when you look, for instance, at the guidelines regarding hypersensitivity pneumonitis, for instance, a lot of them focus on, either the past 2 years or the past 5 years. And when you talk to, I think even the people who make the guidelines will point out that a lot of these, timeline designations are relatively arbitrary. And so the reason I think that people like to focus on near recent exposures is oftentimes those are the ones that are ongoing and the easiest to remediate. And oftentimes the reason that someone, and they're the easiest things to kind of link time-wise to exposure and then time. But I think there's a lot of other exposures that are contributory, as you mentioned. And the ones I think about, again, this is anecdotal, are the things like asbestos, right? Where there's known to be like at least a 30, there can be a 30-year latency period, if not longer, in between exposure and disease. There's also, I think of when I think of remote exposures, it can be frustrating, especially for patients, because it's not something that they can change. It's not something they can do anything about. But I think about them for a couple of different reasons. One, again, if it's an employment issue or if it's a Veterans Administration issue, a lot of times they'll have a lot of resources related to that, just in terms of government benefits and things like that. And the other is I think that sometimes going back to that multiple hit hypothesis where there's, some early genetic predisposition, an early, or an exposure. Sometimes there's multiple exposures and there might have been one a long time ago and one more recently that might have contributed to disease. This also comes up, this is kind of a offshoot, but this also comes up a lot in my sarcoidosis patients where, they might have been diagnosed 20 or 30 years ago. And so you ask them, well, yes, you don't have any exposure to it, but what was your job then? And that might help me figure out, oh yeah, I had this bird back then, or I had this workplace back then that had a lot of exposures and I left it. And that's great that you left it and you felt better, but let's make sure that you don't happen to go into that circumstance again in the future.
Absolutely. That's a great answer. And I think I'll be interested to see, how that impact of timing and latency and stuff like that shows up in the work that you're doing as well.
Mhm.
Um, let's maybe we could even do like a little rapid fire
Sure.
exposure. Is it showing up somewhere in your research or not? Because I've got
Yeah,
a lot
yeah,
of kind of specific ones.
yeah,
Maybe we'll just do a rapid fire
yeah.
couple of these. You mentioned dental hygienists and
Mhm.
dentists. Are you seeing any trends, or do they show up? Hairdressers, stylists.
Yeah, so that's a good question. That one's controversial. There is at least one study from I think around 2000 that showed that hairdressing might have a associated with hypersensitivity pneumonitis. I actually had a debate with this with an occupational medicine specialist a couple weeks ago. She thinks it's more an asthma, like an airway issue, and that also might go into the small airways and cause hypersensitivity pneumonitis. So jury's still out, but I think that's definitely something that could be ongoing. And, again, not medical advice, but, if you're able to stay away from that, if at all possible, that would probably be helpful.
Absolutely. Secondhand smoke. And you
Secondhand
mentioned that.
Yeah, secondhand smoke has been linked definitely to emphysema as well as to coronary artery disease. There's not a clear relationship that I know of to interstitial lung disease, but firsthand smoke and idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis in particular is a really well-known association.
Yeah. You brought up in the very first part of your talk, you
Mhm.
brought up vaping. Uh,
Mhm.
and what I know before the pandemic, when everybody only talked about the pandemic, we had a lot of talk.
Yeah,
I mean,
that
for
summer.
chest at
Mhm.
chest before the
Yeah.
pandemic, that conference, like all the vaping sessions were like booked out, and you had to go to the overflow room to even hear about the latest because it was
Mhm.
such a hot topic.
Mhm.
Is that something that you're seeing too?
I'm not, I'm seeing less and less of that nowadays. I included that just as like an example of, just the fact that we're always seeing new exposures and new linkages. I think vaping is a good example of a big success story because they were able to tie vitamin E acetate that was an additive and specific THC formulations of vape oil, and we're able to remove that from the market. And we've had luckily a lot fewer cases, but I think vaping in particular because it's an ongoing issue, particularly in our adolescent community, and something that's still like an issue who knows what kind of additives could be placed in the future, and it's not as well regulated, I think, as we would like.
Absolutely. Couple of questions on this, maybe it's a little bit too early to know, but the
Mhm.
recalled CPAP devices that we've been
Yeah.
seeing in the
I
news.
I think there's at least one case report out there about mold from the CPAP recall causing hypersensitivity pneumonitis. It's something where I am always asking, it's on my list if you notice that in the slide, like I ask my patients about moldy CPAP and try and get them to not only the recall device, but if it's been a number of years and if sometimes I'm talking to my medicine colleagues directly about like making sure we get a new mask or something and to try and switch that out if you can.
Great. Um, Chlorine in the pool, or chlorine when you're, treating your pool. How about that
Right.
one?
That one, to my knowledge, has not been associated with interstitial lung disease, but is associated with airway diseases and asthma.
Excellent. Let's see. I think I had one more. Oh,
Mm.
this is a more environmental. You talked about air,
Mhm.
air pollution, air quality around. Certainly, there has been concern in the past about uh, community-wide insect sprays. We used to call them skeeter sprayers when I was a kid. I
Mhm.
never see them anymore, but
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
does that show up?
Yeah, that hasn't shown up to my knowledge. But again, a lot of those insecticides are classically associated with airway disease. But uh, I think a good thing in general is those are a lot less frequent. I mean, they're still present, don't get me wrong, but like compared to like the 60s, for instance, a lot less present than they used to be. So I think, while we might not be able to tease, while I would hope to tease out every specific disease exposure relationship, I am optimistic that overall efforts to improve lung health over the past century that will hopefully continue will help some of these diseases from occurring.
All right, and last rapid
Mhm.
fire, and then I have a rapid question.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Jet fuel fumes or diesel fumes?
Huh,
Is that
that's a good one. That's a good question. I know I have a colleague with one patient or a couple patients who are like flight attendants and pilots and air traffic controllers and she wonders about this. I don't have any patients with that particular one. But the diesel again has been associated with obstructive lung disease like asthma and COPD.
excellent? All right, that was my quick rapid fire lightning round.
Love it.
I do want to ask, and
Mhm.
this is not about exposures, but I want to
Okay.
talk about just if somebody's interested in becoming a PFF scholar, can
Oh
you
yeah.
just give us a minute or two, like your experience and what it was like to apply and so on.
For sure, for sure. So, Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation Scholar Program. So you can either apply when you are about to graduate fellowship, so when you're still in training to be a pulmonary and critical care physician, or if you are just newly started. So, I applied when I was just starting basically my job as a pulmonary critical care physician. And it's a grant process. So basically, you write up a project proposal. And because it's more focused on career development too, for which I love for young faculty, you have to identify a mentor who's going to work with you and help guide you through the project. And that for me is Dr. Mary Strack, who again is another pulmonary physician who's very involved in the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation. And so I created a proposal that proposed some of this work that we talked about here today. So using that CARDIA data set as well as some other data sets and full occupational histories. And what it does is it provides me money to both give me a little bit of time to do my research. So it provides me a little bit of time so that instead of seeing clinic patients 100% of the time, I'm seeing them a little bit less in order to really focus on this research. It provides me with money to help for additional people to help out. So again, the research assistants that I mentioned were paid for by the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation. And I think even more importantly, it provides like an overall network. So, I know through the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation, both going to the summits and being a scholar, I know a lot of I've met a lot of both senior faculty, so people to help advise me on my research, as well as other people who are at my same career stage. And so we all kind of know each other. I know I met Dr. Bobby Kakal, as you mentioned, from the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation and a few others that were, either ahead of me in the scholar program or my classmates in the program. And so it enables you to get a head start in this Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation research community, both just for overall career development and to start developing collaborations with other people to advance, the science even quicker than you would have otherwise.
That's wonderful. That is exactly what we're, hoping to do with the Scholars Program. It's been in place for, several years, and we have organizations been able to fund so many amazing projects, incredible people. I really think our scholars are the future of the field, and if anybody's interested in learning more, there is a scholars page on our website, and it talks about all of our current scholars, our past scholars, and the work that they were able to accomplish with their PFF funding. And so many of them have gone on to do great things and really give back to our PFF community as well. So I'm just really grateful to have you here and have you working on behalf of our patients and our community. I think we are almost, yes, we are at the hour. I just wanted to thank everybody for being here today and joining us. We will have upcoming Sunday is the first day of September, which is Pulmonary Fibrosis Awareness Month. If you don't already know this, we will have lots of engagement, awareness activities, social media postings, information. We have our ILD Day webinar on September 18th. So we have just a lot to offer during the month to really educate everybody and raise awareness. So please join us for some of those activities, and definitely for our webinar on the 18th. And also stay when the webinar is over, and please give us your feedback about the session today. Dr. Lee, thank you again for being here. This has been a great session. Thank you for taking so many of our questions. And everybody have a great rest of your week. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you, Dr. Case. Thank you, everyone.